I would like to go right down the panel with this one. My favorite story of the year, of course, is the brilliant John McCain expose in the New York Times. And my question, starting with Bill, is if you were the editor of the New York Times, would you have printed that story about Mr. McCain and his lobbyists? What did you think of the news judgment in printing that story?
I think the story and the main part of the story was fine. I think the focus on the woman and the romantic angle destroyed the rest of the story. So in terms of whether or not he deals with lobbyists, is that some kind of hypocrisy, given the way he's campaigned and the positions he's taken, got lost in this whole thing about was there a romantic relationship with this one female lobbyist. And there was nothing to support that, and why that was so prominent in the story, I think, is the real flaw.
Does anybody on the panel think that the timing of the story or the content of the story was designed to influence the campaign in any way? Joe?
It was. I think it would have been better to do it earlier. The one thing about dealing with the press is when is the story right? And if they wait longer, are they trying to influence the general election? If they do it sooner, so I don't think there's any good time to do the story other than when you think it's ready. And I agree that it might have been a story that was ready, but not the way they put it together. It wasn't. There were some pieces of it I think that made sense and that might be news, but not the way they wrapped it up.
Right. Margaret, do you agree?
Yeah. John McCain is known for issuing like blanket denials, which he did to that story, every part of it. And many parts of that story are true. And in fact, Bill Paxton, who is at the center of the story because he's head of this media company and was actually had a meeting with McCain, there were parts of that the press would have picked up on and followed up on, except that the story itself became toxic and no one wanted to touch it. And so McCain, on the lobbying front, may have been inoculated by that story.
Right. Yeah, I agree. The Washington Post really handled it the best with two stories in the two successive days, which covered most of the lobbying stuff, left out the alleged romance. My guess is what happened is that the reporters and the editors involved became absolutely convinced that this romance was real for whatever reason, from their sources or from multiple sources. And then they forgot the fact that they were convinced that this romance was real was really not adequate reason to print a story about it, which was based entirely on two anonymous sources described as disaffected McCain aides. And one of the most outrageous things I've read in a long time was the Jill Abramson's explanation on the web in the New York Times afterwards, in which she said that it was the paper's obligation to print everything these anonymous sources had told them, otherwise the reader wouldn't get the full flavor of everything these anonymous sources had said, which is just about the opposite of every standard that I was taught when I was at the New York Times.
One of the awful things about journalism is that often all the flavor is in the anonymous sources.
Yeah, but it's the duty of the editor to say, sorry,
and
I can't, you can't,
we
you know.
can't print it.
Yeah. Some of you, I hope, may have read the story that I sent you this morning about our late beloved governor, and my personal favorite, actually, was the story on the op-ed page of the New York Times yesterday by the former sex worker who disputed the idea that most people who use prostitutes are brainless. She said that actually many of her clients had used their brains just fine, but from all accounts, Elliot Spitzer was not one of those. But the story that I want to talk about today is the one by Kimberly Strassel, who says that the press was really an enabler of Elliot Spitzer, who was an extremist right from the start, and the press, instead of reining him in, egged him on. What do you think, John?
Well, I think that Elliot Spitzer did a terrific job over the course of his political career in building up a persona and an image around himself that the press largely accepted. I think that image was powerful enough that it overcame various stories of his various other ethical issues around him, around financing that came to light. It wasn't like those stories weren't reported, but they seemed to be taken as as exceptions rather than as exceptions that prove the rule. It was kind of like, well, that's an aberration. He's this great crusader, and so, well, he may have slipped up, but we'll accept that explanation as having been a slip-up. And I think that, I don't know if I would call that enabling, but it certainly allowed him for a period of time to set himself up for his own fall in a way, because I think of all the things, obviously, that have been most damaging to him in this, apart from the fact that he partook of an illegal activity, was the fact that he's been shown to be such a complete hypocrite.
Right. Bill, in 1968, Gene McCarthy was having an affair with a woman correspondent for one of the network news organizations, and Ben Bradley found this out and told Gene McCarthy's press secretary, Blair Clark, that it was becoming pretty obvious that Gene McCarthy was having this affair, and Blair repeated this to Gene, and Gene said, "Thank you very much," and nothing was ever printed about it. Was it a better world when Washington worked that way?
Well, you know, nostalgia can color your view of many things. You know, you could go to President Kennedy and all of the stories about him, and it was a different world. It was a different sense of things. 1968 might have been the last year of that era, because that was sort of, you know, between the war and the sexual revolution, everything became more and more open, and politicians started to get technologies and approach voters by going into their living rooms and trying to be their friends and be their neighbors and be on a first-name basis, and you create a new relationship. So it's not all the media's fault. There's a fault to go around, but society has evolved dramatically. I don't know if it was a better world, but it was probably a more civil world.
Margaret, how important is it to know about the private lives of public figures if it's not a prostitute?
Well, some of it is useful. You know, candidates bring it on themselves because the picture-perfect family is now front and center. There's, you know, the blonde wife and the two perfect kids in the station wagon.
Well, that was always true, wasn't it?
And the dog, but not so prominently. I mean, now the family is really pushed out there, and there's stories in People magazine about how great they are and what their SAT scores are, and on and on. So, and part of that's brought about by Republicans who made family values such a big thing. So candidates have to do it whether they want to or not. Now, character, which is important, has come to be identified almost entirely with one's sexual behavior. And I think it's part of it, but not all of it, but that's what the public gloms onto and what the press gloms onto, because we're shallow, insubstantial people. But I don't think it's not going to go backwards. I don't think we're, you know, however nostalgic we might be for a day when JFK had his girls, it's not going back there.
Jonathan?
Before you move on, I just want to say that on the op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal, which I read, because you said we had to, I really actually disagreed with it. I really don't think that the press enabled Eliot Spitzer. When I was on the editorial board at the Daily News, it was there that he lied to us about how he was financing his campaign for Attorney General. And it was there in that meeting where basically he lost the editorial page's endorsement, because we had someone on the board who knew the ins and outs of campaign finance law, and we asked him the question.
Was this before or after that story had been written in the press? Do you remember?
It was right around that time that the stories were being written.
Right.
And we zeroed in, asked him the question. He answered it untruthfully. And then, as my former editor and a current columnist at the Daily News has written many, many times, when he called Eliot on the phone and asked him, you know, you said you lied to us. Why did you do that? And Spitzer said to him, I had to. So, you know, the Daily News has continually tried to pull the sheet off of Eliot Spitzer. And keep in mind, once he became, not that he's a Klansman or anything, or any other connotation that might, until I'm really sorry about that. I didn't mean that. If you hadn't been with, I wouldn't have realized it.